This is indeed a very special conversation. We know him as one of the greatest travel writers of our time, but Pico Iyer is perhaps an even bigger advocate of going nowhere, of finding, in his own beautiful words, in the margins of the world, rooms to get lost in and come upon fresh inspiration. It's my absolute delight and honor to be part of this keynote session of the first digital edition of the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival 2020 in conversation with Pico Iyer and one of his old friends, Russ Lewin, also a great traveler, a teacher, and someone we hope will share some secrets about Pico with us today. Pico, Russ, thanks for being with us to talk about what's now being described as the great reset in our lives. But Pico, let me begin by saying, in a sense, each of us now is a travel writer. We're either reminiscing about trips past, or dreaming about future ones on social media. We seem to be suspended in this space between, nostalgia for past journeys and the uncertainty hanging over future ones. How, in your opinion, do we bridge this gap? Is travel writing the way to do it? Is looking inwards the way to do it? What are your thoughts?
Looking around us might be the way to do it. I've always felt that travel is much less to do with new sights than with new eyes. And once you have new eyes, even the old sights become fresh and exciting. So one example is I've been staying in my mother's house here in Santa Barbara. My parents have lived in that same property 54 years, but until this virus season, I'd never walked till the end of the road. And now I've been doing that every morning, and occasionally I'll look around. It's a 40-minute walk maybe. And I'll realize that right in my mother's literal backyard is a scene as beautiful as anything I could see on the planet. But all these 54 years, I've taken it for granted. And suddenly, through the necessity of the virus season, I've had to open my eyes to everything in my vicinity. And I've been reminded of how inspiring and beautiful it is. And I think that speaks to my larger sense about how we're all so painfully aware of how much is being lost during this season. What can we gain? And perhaps by looking afresh at everything around us.
Well, even as we do that, there is this realization that this is, in a sense, an enforced stillness that is upon us right now. This is not something that we have embraced. It is enforced. It's not something that we have a situation we're in of our choice. So given that situation, do you think this will change us as human beings in our responses to external stimuli? Will it change the form that travel takes in the months and years ahead?
Well, to speak to the first part of that question first, I think we have to make sure it changes us in a positive direction. We could either see it as only in terms of catastrophe, or we can see it as opportunity. But you're absolutely right. It inevitably will change us. But when you were saying about enforced stillness, all our circumstances in some ways are imposed on us. And I've always felt that an argument with reality is one that will never win. So we can't wish things were otherwise. We have to work with the conditions we have and see what potential lies inside them. For example, I've been thinking, what am I going to miss about this virus season when things return more to normal? And I'm sure there will be such things. I've been next to my mother every day for the last 6 months. I've had much more time to write. I've had much more time just to catch a breath and take walks. And my hope is that I can incorporate some of those back into my normal life when I return to it. In terms of travel, we are going through this enforced hiatus at the moment. But, I'm old enough to remember how in 1990 we were all hearing about the end of history. And then on September 12th, 2001, we were told here in the US, this is the end of irony. Now we're being told this is the end of travel. And I would say it's a suspension of travel. But we all have to travel just to see our loved ones nowadays. We have to travel to do our jobs. So quite apart from the leisure aspect of travel, I think this season marks the end of predictions, and not the end of travel, but just the end of our projecting what the future will bring.
But having said that, travel is such a deep-seated human imperative. Mankind's urge to travel has shaped the course of history in so many ways, whether it's the rise and fall of civilizations, colonization of new lands, languages and cultures being sort of born out of travel, as it were. when travel comes to this kind of standstill, or at least non-essential travel comes to a standstill, is that going to fundamentally change who we are as human beings?
No, I don't think so. I think it just causes us to reevaluate our priorities and think about what we value the most. And there may be aspects of travel, as you say, that we really miss, but there's a lot of travel that's not so good. Last year, I spent 7 months constantly in the air. And when I look back on it now, I think, what was I thinking? What was I really getting out of that? I know this literary festival is partly, as Rahul was saying, consecrated to ecology. We've been so much kinder to the environment this year, and we all know that travel has been damaging our shared home. So there are many virtues in not traveling. And when we do travel, better than just traveling habitually or reflexively is to travel with a purpose and to make sure you can justify the carbon footprint that you'll be leaving behind. So I don't know. I think if this moment causes us to reevaluate our lives and think about how much do we really want to travel and how much do we want to stay at home, that's a good thing. Because my sense is that for the last 12 or 15 years, many of our lives have been out of balance. We've been sort of driving in a sports car at high speeds around blind curves, and now suddenly we've come to a stop in the road, a red light. And that's not a bad thing if it moves us to think, how do we want to be going forwards? As long as we're moving very fast, we can't really process experience and make reasonable decisions. And I think all of us in the last 6 months have been inspired and encouraged to think about what we want to do going forwards. And one small example, my mother's 89 years old, and she was rushed into the hospital in an ambulance early on in the pandemic, and I had to travel back from Japan to be with her. And when I arrived at her bedside, I thought to myself, what's really going to sustain her? Not my checkbook, not my resume, not any of the books that I've written. The only thing I could really bring to her is whatever resources I've gathered within, as Bachi was saying in the introduction. And I think we're all of us in that state. And this crisis has dramatized the fact that we're only as rich as our inner savings accounts. And that external things aren't really going to help us when we're faced with difficult realities.
So tell us a little more then about your own personal experience of these last few months. You're joining us from California today, and you were in Japan at the start of the global lockdown, as it were. So you've at least had the benefit of some travel in between. For many of us, that's not something we've actually had. So perhaps you could give us an indication of what that's been like and what your personal takeaways have been.
Yes, so to start with the travel, of course, travel these days is easier than it's ever been. I flew from Japan to California, as I was saying, when my mother came out of the hospital. The plane was almost empty. The customs hall was completely deserted. The customs officials were really observing social distancing with a vengeance. So I've never had an easier flight. I just picked up my suitcase, walked to my next flight, and the next flight there were 80 seats and only 2 people on it. So that part is simple. I know that going forwards, people will be apprehensive about plane travel as they haven't been before, and I know plane travel could be more expensive and less frequent than it has been. But the actual physical movements hasn't been hard. One time I was traveling across the Pacific to give a lecture after the pandemic broke out, and I'd contracted to give the lecture. I couldn't say I wasn't going to give it. The next time I was traveling, as I say, to see my mother. 3 weeks from now, I'm planning to go back to Japan to see the rest of my family who are over there. But it's a reminder that most of the bad things that happen to us in life happen within half a mile of our home. And this pandemic has really brought that home to us. So I know that people are going to feel uncertain in planes on 12-hour flights, but I think being around lots of people who are not wearing masks here in California feels to me much more unsettling than the travel part. In terms of what I've been making of the pandemic, I always remember how when my house was lost in a forest fire, and I literally lost everything in the world, initially I was very shocked and taken aback. But a few months later, as I started to remake my life, literally as we were drawing up the plans for a new architectural model of a new home, I thought, how can this move me to live differently? And I noticed I could live with with far fewer clothes and books and furniture than I had before. I realized that all my notes had been burnt down. Now I had to write more from imagination or memory, as you were saying. I realized I didn't have a physical home in California, so maybe I should spend more time in my heart's home, which is Japan. And so in certain ways, that disaster of losing everything in the world opens certain doors and windows in my life that might otherwise have been closed, and actually allowed me to live much closer to the way I'd always wanted to live. And it enforced my sense that what happens to us is much less important than what we make of what happens to us. In other words, your house burns down in a fire, but it's the feelings and thoughts you bring to that that really define what's going to be your life, much more than just the fire alone. So all of us across the globe really have shared these very displacing and unsettling circumstances these last 8 months. But I think some people have seen this as a chance to make a new life, and others have thought, oh, why can't I get back into my old life? But it's really a choice, I feel, that we can make. We can either think about the many things we have, which usually are a cause for gratitude, or we can think of the many things that we don't have, which are usually a recipe for frustration. But I feel it's up to me to make the most of this. I can't wish things are otherwise. That's only going to lead to more exasperation. I have to work with what I've got. And what I've got so far has been plenty.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, of course, the words of Hamlet that you quote quite often come to mind. Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And honestly, so many of us are menaced by our thoughts right now. There are anxieties stemming from loss, whether it's bereavement or loss of work or anxiety about the future. But one thing the pandemic has also taught us is how little we actually need. Having said that, if we all start leading frugal, minimalist lives, then a global economy that hinges on consumerism is likely to go bust quite soon. So your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the inner economy is more important to our well-being in some ways than the global economy. But I love what you said. And it goes back, I have had the fortune, as Bachi was saying, of traveling a lot with the Dalai Lama. And I think what he's been stressing is exactly what you were saying, which is that if we get into a state of anxiety, we're really making things worse and worse. So I was very moved. I once traveled with him to an area that had been laid waste by the tsunami in Japan in 2011. And of course, people there were grieving and sobbing and looking everywhere for direction. And he said, the best thing you can do to honor the people you've lost is think about what kind of future they would like and create the new community that the people who are no longer with us would have wanted to see arrive. You can't change the past. What you can change is the future. So please concentrate on that. And of course, His Holiness often cites this ancient wisdom from Shantideva, the 8th century philosopher. If you've got a problem and you can't solve it, stop worrying about it. There's no solution. And if you can solve it, find the solution. Stop worrying about it too. But worry actually takes us away from clear-sightedness, and that's probably what we most need. And I don't mean to be glib or facile and say we shouldn't worry. I worry all the time, but I'm also conscious that my worries usually are preventing me from seeing things more realistically. And I think, among other things, this season has been a crash course in realism. Not what any of us would have liked, but perhaps what the planet needed, because I feel in the last few years, nature has been sending us many emergency messages, and we've just been sending it to voicemail. We've been proceeding as if we don't have to think about it until the world ends. And this has forced us to stop.
Actually, that's very interesting that you bring that up, and perhaps we could get Russ also to jump in at this stage, because he's been a fellow traveler. He's been with you for at least some of the months of the global lockdown. So much has been said, Russ, about the burden mankind has placed on the planet, the argument that this is nature's way of reasserting herself, locking up human beings so that the rest of the world can catch its breath. There has been this kind of apocalyptic feel to the world this year, the wildfires, the infestations, earthquakes. Do you see this as a message? And what positives do you think have come out of the lockdown or the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Ankita. Well, I think that First of all, you mentioned that you'd like to hear some secrets about him.
I'm sure we all would.
And there's some very juicy secrets I'd like to share. And primarily, in the 45 years that I've known him, every interaction has been inspiring. Whether it's an email or a telephone conversation or just a regular conversation, he brings light to it. And Pico's very much like going out in the sun. It's brighter, you can see things, it's warmer, and you just simply feel good. And when he writes, it's the same thing. So he's got a magnanimity about him and a benevolence that's infectious. So in the respect that the pandemic is a negative thing, he's a positive pandemic. He's somebody that could actually help brighten the world through the ideas that he holds. And, the second thing in relation to Pico, he's one of the hardest working people I've ever encountered. He gets up well before dawn, works for about 7 hours on his writing and his thinking, and in a sense, he's faceting diamonds. So it's as if everybody in the world is a kind of rough diamond, and Pico facets the diamond so that light can shine through it and we can see it for what it really is. Something like a theoretical mathematician, a number theorist, who thinks out solutions to things, and we haven't even raised the questions to that as yet. It's a kind of like instruction in evolution. Those are some secrets everybody should know about Pico. And now, speaking about his discipline, and I'm not sure if people know, but Pico doesn't seek material things. He tries to live a very, very simple life. He has a rule of 3, that he should take a 3-day retreat every season, and a rule of 5, that he doesn't listen to more than 5 minutes of news a day. And I was going to ask Pico, what are the advantages and virtues of a life like that, Pico?
Well, all the classical thinkers always used to say that richness is measured not by how much you have, but by how much you're not missing. That we are sitting here in a very affluent town in California. Many people here are going to therapy every day. There's a lot of pain and suffering. Sometimes I'll walk through the crowded streets of India, which materially seems much less prosperous, but inwardly seems much more affluent. And in some ways, this moment has really dramatized to us that the only resources that really keep us going are inward. I mean, to talk to Ankita's question about nature, I feel that right now, the 3 most important issues before the world are exactly the same as a year ago, which is to say climate change, the refugee situation, and the widening gap between the materially poor and the materially rich. And I know Amitav Ghosh and Fareed Zakaria will be talking about that in the next couple of days. But I don't think we should let the virus distract us from the fact that these problems that were overbearing a year ago, perhaps are only worse now and have been made worse by the virus. And that we're so busy looking at the moment, we sometimes fail to see the larger picture. And the larger picture is that there are these ongoing problems that haven't gone away. Of course, I'd be happy to listen to you talk about my juicy secrets forever, because you're so generous. And there speaks a more than kind friend. But thank you for everything you said.
Well, there's another thing in... Oh, please, Ankita?
No, go ahead, please.
Well, in your book, Autumn Light, which is beautiful in many ways, and people should consider reading it because it offers many sort of interesting algorithms almost, inner algorithms that can bring us greater peace and understanding of things. But in the dedication, you talk about cherishing the seasons within us.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That everything is cyclical, and everything is impermanent. And I know that when I'm feeling wistful, it's not going to last. Equally, when I'm feeling very happy, I know that's not going to last forever. And I think the cultures of East Asia, like Japan, where I've lived for all these 33 years, are very wise about that. And it's interesting, I'm touched that you mentioned my book of last year, because I was publishing a book about mortality and uncertainty a year ago without knowing that it would be the pressing issue on everybody's minds right now. Mm-hmm. But I think what I've learned in Japan all these years is that it's a culture based around the idea of impermanence. But impermanence isn't a cause for grief. It's actually a wake-up call, and it's a reminder, because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or tonight, to find our beauty or our joy, our inspiration right now. We can't take anything for granted. And actually, impermanence, therefore, is a spur to a kind of more positive life. It goes back to what Ankita was saying about anxiety. Just after the pandemic broke out, I heard from a friend of mine who's a Catholic monk, and he wrote to all his friends, and he said, remember, the best cure for anxiety is thinking of others. And as Ankita was saying, I spent the first couple of months of the pandemic in Japan, which is a society where people very much are habituated from an early age to thinking in terms of the community and everybody around them. And so I noticed much less panic, insanity, lack of calm there. People seem to think this is the nature of life. Life brings us challenges, and the best way to respond to the challenges is to tend to the larger whole, our community. And so it's the kind of thing that I learn a lot from in Japan. And so in my book, Autumn Light, I was trying to almost say, what does this old seasoned culture, this very seasoned, have to teach those of us from a newer place?
Very beautiful.
If I could jump in at this point and just follow up from there, Pico, you split your time between Japan and the US, and two countries whose responses to the pandemic couldn't be more different.
Yes.
In the US, you have a president who says catching the coronavirus was a gift of God because it exposed him to experimental treatments. And the entire rhetoric is spun with an eye on the elections now less than a month away. And as you were saying, Japan seems to have had a very different response to the pandemic than from most other countries in the world. So if you'd like to just, perhaps dwell on those differences a little and what you've learned from them.
Yes, I see it essentially as a difference between a very young society and a very old world. And I think the whole globe is really defined by that difference. And so America's great gift to the world is living in the future tense. It's a place of youth, of possibility, of freshness. Japan's great gift to the world, like India's or China's, is that it's an old man. It's been through a lot. It's seen so much of humanity and so much of experience, and it knows how to deal with every kind of reality that comes up. So I found America a very exhilarating place to be when I was young. But when I was 29, I moved to Japan because I thought now is the time to learn about reality, impermanence, suffering, those kind of great Buddhist truths. And I think all of that has really come forth during the pandemic because, as you say, the leadership in America has looked away from reality rather than looking straight at it, and has taken us often into a kind of fantasy land, encouraging us to think of how we wish things were rather than the way they actually are. And so many Americans have really suffered bitterly because of that. Japan looks at it just as it looks like at the 24 typhoons that sweep through the country every year, which you experienced last year, or the many fires that it's had to deal with and the wars it's had to go through for 1400 years. In other words, it's been through a lot of things. It knows life is never going to be easy, and it knows that sacrifice is very important. And I'm not sure that the idea of sacrifice is quite so strong in the United States as a young society as in Japan or in India, nor the notion of community. I think that's much more fractured in a place like California than in Japan. So in some ways, the older societies have been able to draw upon that centuries of wisdom in this moment of crisis, and they've come to their rescue. And I've noticed even among individuals, my friends who are in their mid-30s have been very panicked by the pandemic. The friends who are in their 70s have been much calmer, and it's not because they're at the end of their lives or because they're retired and they're not worried so much about the global economy. I think it's more because of everything that they've seen, and they've seen how life is cyclical, and they're not swayed so much by every new event that comes along.
Right. No, but with over 1 million deaths now worldwide, the specter of death has clearly loomed over all of us in the last few months. Death is a subject that everyone is dwelling on far more, perhaps, than they did forever in their lives. And that's a subject that you bring out so beautifully in Autumn Light, which Russ just mentioned as well. You take the subject of grief following the death of your father-in-law and the comfort that rituals bring at such a time. Just to extend what you were telling us right now, do you think Japan has a different way of approaching both aging and death that, in a sense, has actually helped it come to terms with the pandemic in ways that the rest of us would do well to learn from?
Well, that's beautifully said. I couldn't put it better myself. Exactly so. You probably know, because I know you were visiting Japan last year, that in Japan, old age is a good thing, which in California it's not. In Japan, the first thing to do when you meet somebody, the polite thing to do is ask her how old she is, because then you know how deeply to bow and where you stand in the hierarchy in relation to her. Here in California, many people want to look as young as possible. In Japan, there's a cachet in looking old. And exactly so, as you said wonderfully, death is something many of us haven't been thinking about. And I think it's folly. Death is something that in Japan they do think about. And I'm grateful to be forced to think about death, because that makes me think about how I want to live my life. And when I think of what my friends and I were talking about at the beginning of this year, which was probably Meghan, Prince Harry, and Brad Pitt, I think it's a better thing that we be thinking about anxiety, death, uncertainty, hope, solitude, opportunity. The whole world has been made serious in certain ways by these last few months. And as you say, in India, I think too, as in Japan, people live close to death. And that's something that they often think about. But in these more gated communities, privileged places like Santa Barbara, California, where we often can go for months without thinking about death, I think we almost need this wake-up call to give clarity to our life. And as you say, in Japan, the thing I noticed when my father-in-law died is that, typical of Japan, for the first 48 or 72 hours, everybody knows what she has to do. There's a dinner after 12 hours. There's a funeral after 17 hours. There's a cremation after 20 hours. 3 days later, the Buddhist priest comes to the house and delivers chants. And I think there's a real wisdom in that, because all of us are at a loss after a death of a loved one. We're angry, we're sorrowful, we don't know where to turn. And in those moments of uncertainty, to be told what marks to hit, as it were, what to do for those initial 72 hours is a great help. Of course, the grief will be as great in Japan as anywhere else, but just being given a certain direction when you're at your most fragile is helpful. And I find maybe here in California, when somebody dies, we're all shocked and taken aback, and we don't know what to do. And again, older cultures, India too, very much, are offering pointers as we wander through a life that by its nature is marked by uncertainty.
If I can bring Russ back in here once again. Russ, do you think Pico sort of has special insights into subjects like mortality and aging and so on, because he is poised on this sort of cusp between three cultures? You know, he has his Indian origin, he's lived in the US for so long, and now in Japan as well. And each has its own way of dealing with these very complex issues.
Without a question. Pico's a kind of man for all seasons, and I view him as a cosmic traveler. So he's really of no one country but all countries, and not one person but all people. And this seems to have given him a really unique perspective on things. In fact, one of the things he said is one of the things you should never take on a trip is expectation. And when we read his work, what jumps out at us is this really clear perception, just crystalline clear, that many of us, would strive to achieve, but can't due to our prejudices and whatever perspectives we may have, inherited or assumed. But Pico seems to have been able to just purify and clear away the fog so that he could see, straight up into the heavens and see the stars. And Pico, I don't know, perhaps you could comment on how is it that you maintain this pure perception before a trip, during a trip, and after a trip when you're doing the harvesting?
Well, thank you. Thank you for more generous comments. I suppose I always travel as a student, and my aim is to listen to a place rather than to lecture to it. And I feel I'm meeting a fascinating stranger when I go to a place for the first time. I want to find out everything about her life. And therefore, I have to assume I know nothing about her life and very little about that culture. And it has a lot to instruct me. I also want to say that Ankita, wonderfully invoking the US and England and Japan, left out one important country, which is India. And I think I owe a lot to my Indian heritage, because you knew my parents, and both steeped in Hinduism, my mother teaching Sanskrit here, both professors of religion and philosophy. And I think they helped to give me this this more universal perspective from the time I was a very small child, growing up in England, going to Anglican schools, but they were telling me about Buddhism and training me in Hinduism. And when I talk about the difference between the old culture and the new culture, or the old world and the new world, of course, as America's approaching its election 26 days from now, it's interesting to think there may be an Iyer very close to the White House in Kamala Harris, bringing some of the wisdom of India to the United States. And I think the US is clearly going through a very confused time. But I think its one resource for many years now has been that it's been such a magnet to the world. The American dream still lives on, and that it can draw on the wisdom of India and Japan and China and Iran and Israel and Europe and Russia and everywhere else. And that's ultimately its great competitive advantage in the globe, that it too potentially has a more global perspective precisely because it doesn't have deep roots in the way that a China or Japan does. But maybe that's taking us too far from the pandemic.
Well, perhaps it is, but it's been wonderful listening to all of this as well. And if you'll allow me to bring you back, as it were, to the sort of grim specter that hovers over all of us, I think a lot of our listeners would actually like to hear about who you turn to, the authors you turn to for solace and comfort at these times.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed because usually I'm devouring the latest work of fiction, probably from an Indian author. But these 7 months of stillness have really propelled me back to the classics. So I've been reading Marcel Proust, who's a great expert living almost his whole life in a bedroom. Because he was sitting so still, he understood everything about society and about the mind and the tricks that the mind plays. I reread Paradise Lost, which I never thought I was going to do this summer. And I was reminded at the end of Paradise Lost, the angel says to Adam, "Now you can find a paradise within, better by far." In other words, Paradise Lost is not a sad story. It's not about the losing of paradise. It's about the losing of an external paradise so that you create a paradise within. So it's been helpful to me, as I never would have done if I were flying around the globe as I usually do, during 6 months of stillness, to go back to these books I read when I was much too young, in my late teens or early 20s, and now in my early 60s, to get much more out of them. I've been reading more poetry, and poetry is a great way of slowing down and expanding one's attention. And I feel that this pandemic moment has given many of us a chance to live at a much more human pace than we were before, and to do the kind of things we said we didn't have time to do the last 20 years, namely take a walk, listen to music, read books. I've been inspired by how many people have been reading books, and by reading books, they've been actually stretching their attention span and learning intimacy and nuance and things that we don't always get when we're rushing from place to place. So, of course, I'm speaking for the fortunate who still have a roof over our heads, still have a livelihood, and still have relatively healthy relatives. But for those of us who so far have been getting through the pandemic almost okay, I think it's a great chance to think about what we cherish and how to make sure that we don't lose it, as so often we have in recent years.
But having said that, there's also been such an information overload in this virus season.
Yes.
Some of it relevant, some of it just plain alarmist or untrue. How does one stay centered when just looking at a device, could raise your anxiety levels, cause you to go down another rabbit hole? I mean, I speak for all of us over here, whether it's someone like me who's part of the news cycle 24 hours a day, or anybody who just wants more information about the coronavirus. There's so much of it out there, most of it alarming. How do you stay away from it all?
Well, Russ already gave away one of my secrets, and I'm embarrassed to say it to an anchor at NDTV, but I literally never take in more than 5 minutes of the news every day. Ideally 2 minutes or 1 minute, because just as you say, I feel that distraction, information overload, and speed are the main threats to peace of mind. And that's what's causing us anxiety. That many of my friends have not really suffered firsthand from the virus so far. What they've mostly been suffering from is all the panic they're hearing from conflicting experts, and the fact that so much of the news cycle, as you say, is devoted to either opinion or speculation or assessments by experts that we can't really assess. So I've been trying to think much more about what would the Stoics say? What would Jesus say? What would the Dalai Lama say? What would Pope Francis say about this pandemic? Not what would CNN or Talk Radio or the New York Times say. And I think that's helped to steady me, to give me the larger picture. Because ideally, 2 years from now, we'll all have moved on. We'll remember this, but it'll be a distant memory. And what are we going to have to deal with then? And as I said about climate change, I don't think we can afford to let the COVID-19 crisis or even the US election crowd out what are much more ongoing and probably immediate problems. So you're absolutely right. I think I was writing to you yesterday that in the course of my professional life, it seems the world has gone from not having enough information to having far too much. And I often remember how the average person today takes in more data every day than Shakespeare did in his entire lifetime. Does that mean that we're wiser than Shakespeare? I think it actually could mean that we're less wise and more confused than Shakespeare, and that we've passed the point of diminishing returns. And that's not to do a discredit to what you do, and I'm a journalist too, so my living depends on reporting the news.
But let's just expand on that. What is it that
Yes.
the Dalai Lama would say rather than, what we hear on CNN or NDTV or, for that matter, Time Magazine or the New York Times? What is it that we really need to hang on to?
First, that sense that the best cure of anxiety is looking after others. The last time I was traveling across Japan with the Dalai Lama, a year before the pandemic, he said the world is going through an emotional crisis. And he'd never seen levels of panic and rage and confusion as great as he already saw in 2018. And he said the answer to that is training the mind. We have to use our mind to make sure that we're not getting buffeted or overturned by everything that comes along, to be able to steer our ship serenely and safely during these storms that are pushing us this way and that. And that can only come from the mind. We can't change circumstances. The only thing we can change is how we respond to circumstances. That's the part that's within our control. So we can't fret about the virus because that's clearly much larger than we are. We have to work with what we can begin to change in our own lives and in our own perceptions. And I hesitate to speak for the Dalai Lama, but that's one of the things that I hear and learn from when he talks.
Right. I'm going to start taking some questions from our very receptive audience. Julie Mehta writes, reevaluate our lives since I first read The Lady and the Monk and met Pico Iyer. This has been the subliminal quest in all your many books. How does your Zen practice help you refine your quest, she asks.
Well, thank you, Julie. I remember the day after I lost everything in the world, in the first fire, because my job was to be a columnist for Time Magazine, I drove right to a friend's house and I wrote an article about sitting under the fire and watching it burn everything down to ash. And because I'd been spending time in Japan, I ended that article an hour after the fire with a 17th century haiku, now quite well known, that says, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." So in some ways, even the evening when I lost everything in the world, some part of me thought, how can this help me see my priorities more clearly? And I've never really practiced Zen officially, but I've been lucky to learn from a lot of people around me in Japan. And I think the main thing I've learned is priorities, and not to get distracted by the trivial stuff, but to try to keep one's eye on the essential.
It's important that you talk about how right after you lost everything in the world, you sat down and wrote that article. Tell us a little more about that. I mean, California right now has seen some terrible wildfires, but your experience dates back to 20 years ago when you lost your own home in the wildfire.
Yes, and I was actually stuck in the middle of that fire for 3 hours on the road, watching the flames systematically pick through my living room and reduce everything in our bedrooms to ash and then wipe out my next 8 years of writing. And of course, being caught in the fire for 3 hours meant that at the end of the day, I thought, I'm so lucky not to have lost my life. I wasn't thinking about having lost my possessions, but I was thinking I was blessed not to lose my breath in some ways. In those days, at that time, it was the worst fire in Californian history. 450 houses were destroyed. Now, as you were saying, every day there are fires like that. And in other parts of the world, as you were saying, also hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis. So I feel that's where we have to turn our attention. And that's where it's up to us to make the decisions that are going to enable our environment to live more happily and us to live more happily with it. But that's our decision, really, to make or not to make. And this virus moment has given us a chance to think about it.
I'm going to take another question. Shloka Nath asks, and if we can get that question up again. All right, we seem to have lost that. But essentially, her question was about how do we hone in on what we're missing out on?
Well, maybe start by honing in on the things that you've been able to do this season that you weren't doing before, that you're grateful for. For example, I've had dinner with my mother every day for the last 6 months. That hasn't happened since I was 8 years old. As a writer, I've been able to write every day for the last 5 months. That hasn't happened for 34 years. So even as I've been frustrated, as you were saying, not to travel and not to be able to go to the movies and go and watch a basketball game, on the other hand, all these new opportunities have been dropped in my lap. And my sense is that most of us have certain of those things. Many of us say, oh, I've been so glad to spend more time with my wife, to take walks with my kids, to not to have to go to the office every day. Think about those things. And again, I'm sure there are many in almost every life.
Well, I think we've really sort of had some wonderful insights today. If there was one last thing that you would like to sort of leave our viewers with today, Pico, what would that be? What would that thought be to sort of take us through perhaps, the next few weeks and months, difficult as they're going to be?
I think uncertainty is always a feature of our lives, and is especially a feature of our lives in the next few months. But there are certain things we can be certain of, which is this moment. And I'm thinking to myself, the rest of the day, I don't know how it's going to go. But right now, I'm talking to Ankita and Russ. Let me give all myself to this and get out of it what I can, especially because I can't take anything for granted. And I think not being able to take very much for granted in some ways really focuses our attention. So if we have greater attention than ever before, let's turn it to the things that really sustain us and return to our normal lives closer to the things that we love and closer to things that really keep us going. And I think most of us are more conscious of that now than we were a year ago.
I think this has possibly been the most positive conversation I've been part of during this pandemic, and I can't tell you how wonderful that makes me feel. And I go away from here with a feeling of positivity and optimism. But before I go, I would want to ask you again. You've gone back to the classics, but if there were 3 books that you would recommend as sort of essential pandemic reading, what would those be?
One would be a book called An Interrupted Life by Etty Hillesum, who was a young woman in her 20s, who, like most of us in her 20s, was confused, didn't know where to go. Suddenly, the Holocaust came to the Netherlands, where she was, and the more crisis approached her, the wiser she became, till by the end of her book, she's wiser than any sage. And she's just a typical everyday woman in her 20s. Very inspiring book. The book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, although I'm not a Zen student, is a great recipe for clarity. And whenever friends of mine are confused or feeling down, I give it to them the way I'd give them an aspirin. And maybe the third book would be from Mumbai's own Rohinton Mistry, whom I got to hear at Bachi's Festival a few years ago, and his book, A Fine Balance, because I think it looks unflinchingly at a challenge and possibility and keeps hope and history in the same perspective. And I think that's what all of us need to do, to look at reality, but not to give up hope, and to keep both of them alive. And I think A Fine Balance for 25 years has been my talisman for doing that.
So An Interrupted Life, A Zen Mind, A Fine Balance. Thank you very much indeed, Pico Iyer, for your recommendations, for your wise words of wisdom, for perhaps giving us a glimpse of the stillness that you seem to draw so much from. And perhaps we will be able to as well going forward. Pico Iyer, Russ Lewin, thank you for being part of this session. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you, Ankita.
Thank you.